When a 13-year-old Wisconsin boy vanishes in the summer of 2023, investigators learned that he had aspirations of trying to survive off-grid in the wilderness. Despite the discovery of abandoned campsites and extensive search efforts, a child remains missing in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up. This episode contains discussion on the topic of suicide. Please listen with care. Also, this case was recommended to us by a listener, so thank you very much to the individual who let us know about James' disappearance. James Yoblonski was last seen alive on June 12, 2023. He was 13 years old at the time and lived with his dad, brothers, and sister in Reedsburg, Wisconsin. Reedsburg is a small town located in the southern half of the state. The Baraboo River runs through it, and it's surrounded by designated state wildlife and natural areas, all accessible with just a short drive. It's a scenic area with lots of opportunities for outdoor recreation and the sort of town that many might consider a safe place to raise a family. Crime rates in Reedsburg are significantly lower than the national average and the Wisconsin state average. Violent crimes are comparatively few and far in between. James had grown up in the area and loved to camp and fish, both activities that there were abundant opportunities to pursue. He was the second youngest of 4 children with 2 older brothers and a little sister. His dad, Bill, was a single dad. He and the mother of their 4 kids had divorced 5 years before, and according to reporting by WISN 12 News, by the summer of 2023, she wasn't involved in her kids' lives and had not been for several years. James' dad, Bill, supported his family via a small local golf cart sale and repair business that he owned and ran. As for James, he was a student, of course, a rising 8th grader at Jack Young Middle School, where he was generally regarded as a quiet kid. By June, however, classes were out for the summer. On the evening of James' disappearance, a Sunday, he, his siblings, and his dad, Bill, all watched a movie together in the living room of their home. According to what Bill later told journalist Rachel Perry, nothing seemed out of the ordinary that evening. In contrast, one of James' older brothers did later say that he thought that James had been acting a little strangely that day, but attributed it to James simply being in his early teens. In any case, it wasn't until the following morning that anyone realized that something was wrong, that James was missing. Not only was James inexplicably gone, the family van was conspicuously missing as well, which came as quite a shock considering that James, at 13 years old, was certainly not licensed to drive. The only driving experience he had was from the times that his dad had let him move the van just short distances through the parking lot at his workshop. James had never driven it or any vehicle on an actual street before.
So he had a basic understanding of at least how to get the cars in gear and drive them short distances. So he wasn't somebody that was just trying to figure it out that likely would have run into a tree within the first couple of feet.
Yeah, that's true. And James had driven away from the family home in the van successfully the night before. We know because the Yoblonski home was equipped with an outdoor security camera. And that camera had captured James walking out of the home at about 1 a.m. the night before, carrying a backpack and 2 other bags into the van, which he sat in for about an hour before finally driving away.
I really wish we had some insight into what he was thinking about and what was going on in his mind during that hour.
Sure, and I'm sure investigators do too. So, Scott, here's a still frame from that security footage showing James as he walked away from the home into the van that night. As you can see, he's loaded down with luggage.
Yeah, it's definitely more than what we normally think of when we talk about teenage runaways, just pretty much taking the clothes on our back. He looks like he's actually prepared and thought about this for a while.
Yeah, he looks like he's going somewhere for at least a relatively long haul. He's loaded down with bags. And for all of you listening, we've got this still frame up on our website. Of course, the link is in the show notes if you'd like to see it for yourself.
It is kind of hard to see because it is night, though. It's not like a crystal clear image.
Right. It's black and white. It's not going to dazzle you with the image quality, but you can see a child walking away loaded down with bags. So, without a word to his family about his intentions, James had packed up a variety of his belongings, including virtually all of his clothes, and set off into the night in the family vehicle. He had never done anything like it before. Naturally, as soon as Bill realized what had happened, he contacted the local police and reported James missing. Well, almost as soon as. There was a brief delay caused by the fact that Bill's phone, like James and the van, was also missing. It would turn out that James had taken his dad's phone too when he'd left the house. Bill was panicking but managed to gather his other kids, and together they made their way to the police station. That was at approximately 9 a.m., and Bill didn't know it at the time, but local police had already discovered an important clue. And actually, they didn't realize its importance either, at least not until Bill reported James missing.
So, I'm just going to guess that the mystery clue there was the van?
Yes, it was the van. Earlier that morning, before the Yoblonski family had woken up to find James missing, a deputy had noticed a van sitting empty alongside Route 12 just outside of the town of Baraboo and on the outskirts of Devil's Lake State Park, which is approximately a 30-minute drive from Reedsburg.
Okay, so he did a pretty good job to get away from the house and driving, I'm guessing.
Right.
I'm sure the late night meant the roads were relatively empty.
Yeah, it was late night. This is a small town/rural area, so for the most part, he probably had the roads to himself. Now, the deputy had tagged the van as an abandoned vehicle, which meant that it would eventually be towed from the roadside. At the time, James hadn't been reported missing yet, so the Chrysler minivan appeared to be like any other abandoned vehicle that had probably just broken down on the side of the road. After James was reported missing, though, investigators realized its importance and immediately began searching the wooded area along the highway for any sign of James. Bill's cell phone, which James had taken, had proven to be a boon to investigators. They pinged its location and saw that it was somewhere in the vicinity of the abandoned van. They ended up locating the phone on the side of Route 12, but not the side the van was parked on, the opposite side of the highway.
Okay, my first guess with the phone was he probably used it for GPS navigation.
That's very possible.
So he probably had a place picked out that he wanted to go to. At night, he might not have been very familiar with the road, so that would have given him direction at least. And then once he knew which heading he was generally going into, he probably dropped the phone so he couldn't be found.
I think that's a strong possibility. Now, investigators then searched the woods and made another discovery approximately 100 yards or about 91 meters from the highway. According to WKOW News, they found clothing belonging to James, hygiene items, and bags, including, according to WISC News, the backpack James had been wearing on security footage that we saw. For whatever reason, it appeared as if he'd abandoned many of his belongings at the site in the woods, which some describe as a makeshift campsite. To be clear, though, as best I can tell from that photo and from what I've read during the course of my research into this case, there was no sign of any shelter being set up at the site or of any fire or any of the typical things we may think of when we hear the word campsite. It was basically just a spot in the woods where James appeared to have set down at least some of his stuff and had perhaps spent some time before ultimately leaving.
So my main thought is he was probably planning that as some sort of base camp area. And obviously, while he's going to go get materials to make some sort of shelter or to make some sort of fire pit or whatever he needed there, he didn't want to carry all of that baggage because it would have been fatigued and it would have given him markers to make sure they got back to the same spot.
Right, like he could have been out looking for kindling, firewood, branches for shelter, or something like that?
Yeah, something to establish the base camp, because obviously when you first get out into the woods, nothing is set up. And if he didn't feel like carrying a large tent with him, or if he didn't have a large tent that was easily accessible for this planned venture, like I said, he wouldn't have had access to that. So it wouldn't have been able to just easily set up a campsite. And you're talking about it being late at night and dark.
Yeah, he would probably have to wait until morning to reasonably try to get anything like that together.
Yeah.
Now, I imagine that the discovery of this campsite, as rudimentary as it was, probably had investigators feeling hopeful. I mean, I'm sure it had occurred to them that James might have been out looking for materials, like you said, or might have been hanging out at that location and might have retreated further into the woods when he'd heard them approaching, leaving most of his stuff behind in his haste to avoid detection.
It's very possible.
However, investigators searched the surrounding woods immediately and extensively, but were unable to find James. And when I say the search was extensive, I mean it. Officers and deputies from a variety of jurisdictions participated, as did personnel from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. They spent days scouring the woods, which, with it being June, were dense with thriving vegetation. Detective Scott Steinhorst later told journalist Rachel Perry, quote, "The terrain in that area is extremely rugged. It's rocky and it's thick. You could be standing 6 feet apart and not see each other," end quote.
Yeah, I'm sure they used tracking canines and a myriad of other techniques to try to find him.
Yeah, definitely. And despite all that thick, coarse vegetation, they covered thousands of acres. And in addition to having many literal pairs of boots on the ground, investigators conducted canine searches, like you said, as well as aerial searches via helicopter and drone, all with no luck. They even used heat-seeking technology.
Yeah, one of my first thoughts was the heat-seeking technology. If you're talking about vegetation that thick and dense, it's going to have very minimal effectiveness because of tree foliage.
Perhaps, but they at least did give it a try. They really pulled out all the stops with this search. Strangely, though, tracking canines were unable to pick up James' scent at the abandoned campsite.
So for them to not even pick it up at this campsite, it does make me wonder if maybe his baggage just became too heavy for his teen body to handle. And he had to just drop some of his less important valuables in order to be able to push further into the woods.
It's possible. You walk into the woods with a backpack and 2 duffel bags in the summer, you're going to get very tired of carrying that fast, so it's hard to say.
I get tired of carrying my water up a 2-mile hike.
During the search, investigators located a second campsite in the woods where James had left belongings behind once again. According to WMTV News, the items left behind included socks, a jug of water, and an empty knife sheath, but no James.
Okay, so those are a little bit more of those more important possessions.
Yeah, the water for sure. Now the socks, maybe they were wet or sweaty. I find abandoned socks on trails all the time. People just dump them in the woods. That's not uncommon, sadly.
Those things are a little bit more likely to make it further into the woods than a duffel bag full of clothing.
Sure. Now, it wasn't just law enforcement who searched for James either. Although authorities warned citizens that searching could be dangerous, many people, including various members of James' family, did it anyway. They weren't going to be stopped from looking for him. James' great-aunt by marriage, Mary Wegner, was one of the extended family members who got involved. Her motivation was doubly personal. In 1992, her own daughter, Lori, had gone missing and had never been found. Mary told reporter Rebecca Roloff that when she learned another member of their family had gone missing, she felt sick to her stomach. James' disappearance brought back memories of her own daughter's vanishing, almost making it feel as if she was reliving the tragedy again. As for James' immediate family, they'd been plunged into a tragedy of their own that they'd never imagined. Bill spoke to local media, stressing that James was not in trouble and that he wasn't mad, he just wanted him to come home. When it came to James' case, the physical search efforts over challenging terrain were grueling, and 2 law enforcement officers were injured on rocky bluffs. The terrain was that rough. So, not having found James in the wilderness despite their best efforts, investigators switched their focus to a different type of search, an electronic one.
Okay.
James had had access to several internet-connected devices, including a tablet. Investigators gathered those devices and searched them for any clues as to where James might have gone. What they found provided a good deal of insight into James's mindset around the time of his disappearance. More on that next. And now, back to James' story. When intensive physical search efforts failed to produce any sign of James beyond 2 abandoned makeshift campsites, investigators' focus turned digital. They collected internet-connected items, including a tablet owned by the Yoblonski family and a school-issued computer that James had had access to, and mined the data for clues. This time, their search efforts revealed quite a bit. According to multiple sources, such as WMTV News and WISC News, James' search history in the months leading up to his disappearance included queries on how to live off-grid, as well as how to leave the state. Upon reviewing James' search history, investigators realized that James had been planning, or at least contemplating, his disappearance for months. Alarmingly, it seemed as if he might have been planning to strike out on his own in the wilderness and try his hand at off-grid living. As I mentioned earlier, the terrain was tough enough that 2 police officers were injured during the search for James. The idea of a child trying to survive on their own in the woods near Devil's Lake, or in any wilderness really, was alarming. The ways in which a kid trying to survive alone in those woods might be seriously or even fatally injured are numerous. Also of concern was the fact that, according to Bill, a handgun was missing from the gun safe located at his business. He says the safe was locked, but nevertheless, he believes that James accessed the safe somehow and took the missing gun with him.
When you're talking about a disappearance like this, that has to be taken very seriously. It's
Yes.
absolutely a possibility.
Sure, and for what it's worth, when James took the van on the night of his disappearance, he did go to the location of his dad's business. Investigators know because they traced James' journey that night using location data from his dad's cell phone, which, as we mentioned earlier, he'd taken when he'd run away. Detective Scott Steinhorst later told WKOW News that James, quote, traveled through the city of the Dells, the village Lake Delton, just about in Adams County, back in the South County, through the city of Reedsburg, and then eventually to Highway 12 where the van was found, end quote. So he did quite a lot of driving around that night.
Yeah.
Notably, James had stopped at his dad's golf cart dealership, which was, of course, closed at that hour, not once, but twice. Investigators say they've tried to determine what exactly he did while he was there, but they haven't had any luck.
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe I was incorrect with using GPS. Maybe he was just trying to figure out his route to a few places and he took a few wrong turns and he knew where his dad's golf cart business was. So he went back there to restart to go to this other location.
To reorient himself?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a possibility. Now, they do think, though, that James may have taken the firearm, just as his dad suspects. Of course, the possibility of James having a gun is alarming any way you look at it. Make no mistake, though, there are multiple ways to look at it. If James took the gun, we don't know what his reasoning was, but there are a couple of obvious possibilities. First of all, the gun raises concerns of suicidal ideation. What if James had absconded into the woods with the intention of ending his life? It's a troubling thought, and one that's perhaps bolstered by another piece of digital evidence that came to investigators' attention, a Snapchat video. On the night of James' disappearance, a video was posted on a Snapchat account belonging to James. In it, a male is speaking as he drives a Chrysler vehicle, presumably the Yoblonski family van. Only the road and a little bit of the vehicle's interior are visible, not the driver's face, but the voice in the video is James, and here's what he says, quote, "Everyone who is a friend of mine, I'm probably not going to make it back to school. I've just had these crazy thoughts lately. Sorry for everyone who cares about me. It's not their fault. My brain, something happened to it. I feel like I want to explain it, but I don't know how. I'm scared, sad. I have no emotions anymore. I've lost them. I'm not processing anything. My brain is... something happened to it." End quote. The Snapchat video is available online, so anyone can watch it for themselves. I've watched it, and it's sad to hear how much distress James seemed to be in. I'm no doctor, but it certainly sounds like James was describing a struggle with depression. The statement James gave in the video was a heavy one that sets off immediate alarm bells. Although the subject of suicide isn't broached outright, James indicates that he's suffering from mental anguish and is going to do something that will upset those who care about him. That sort of language, combined with the fact that he may have had access to a firearm, is extremely concerning.
It is. Also, my mind kind of goes to maybe he understands the dangers of trying to do this off-grid living, and it could be that he thinks that he just won't be able to make it out there, but he's going to try.
I think that's possible too. And who knows how long he's thinking of staying out there. He might think, well, I'm going to go out there and I'm not going to come back, and maybe I'll survive, maybe I won't.
He may even think that he'd still be out there today, just surviving out in the wilderness.
You know, it may sound fantastical to us, but keep in mind this is a 13-year-old child.
Yeah.
So investigators didn't necessarily think that suicide was James' intent. Although he was obviously experiencing distress, they thought he might be trying to live out his off-grid survivalist aspirations. Maybe he didn't want to escape life altogether, but rather to escape the everyday version of life he'd obviously been struggling with. Sauk County Sheriff's Office Patrol Lieutenant Stephen Schramm told media, quote, "We learned that he has made comments or at least talked to some of his fellow students in the past, essentially saying, 'How long do you think I can survive in the woods by myself for?' That was something that triggered to us. Okay, maybe this isn't somebody who's in distress, but somebody who went out into the woods with a purpose," end quote. And if that was the case, James may have taken the gun with the intention to carry it as a method of protection in the wilderness and or a hunting tool.
If I was going to go try to survive off grid, a firearm for safety would be one of my key priorities to try to carry with me into the woods.
Sure. Now, the firearm was a .380 caliber handgun, so it by no means was an ideal hunting gun, and he certainly was not going to save himself from a bear or anything like that.
The .380 is just a underpowered 9mm. Think of them 9mm short.
Right. Basically, it's not a very powerful firearm, and it's, a handgun, which you don't want to be hunting with anyway, but Keep in mind that James was only 13 years old. If he intended to hunt for food during his survivalist mission, he may have figured that the gun, any gun, would be better than nothing, and it's not like he could walk into a gun store and buy himself a hunting rifle. Now, on this note, although James had a keen interest in the outdoors and loved to fish, he had not actually hunted before, so he was probably not familiar with firearms. His dad felt that he was old enough to hunt at 13, though, and had actually planned to take him hunting that fall. James had really been looking forward to that trip, but of course, he ended up missing it, along with several other milestones, holidays, and special occasions that occurred throughout the rest of 2023. Scott, I think the items James carried into the woods say a lot about what his intentions may have been.
To me, it really speaks like somebody that's going to try to go out there and survive as long as possible with no intention of coming back into society.
Right, the firearm aside, when James left, he took a large amount of supplies, a backpack, and 2 duffel bags full of things like water, a knife, yes, the gun, probably, and numerous changes of clothing. Actually, James had taken just about all of the clothing he owned into the woods. Those do not seem like the actions of someone who planned to end his life immediately, if at all. Those seem like the actions of someone who intended to survive for a while. After all, who packs their entire wardrobe on a suicide mission? Additionally, according to WKOW News, James had a small collection of survival books, which his dad said he couldn't find in the home after his disappearance. It seemed likely that he'd taken them along when he'd left. But the reality is that a 13-year-old child has incredibly little chance of surviving in the Wisconsin wilderness for very long. James may have had fantasies of vanishing into nature and somehow sustaining himself, but they were just that, a child's fantasies. He, of course, didn't have the means to survive for an extended period of time. And even if he somehow miraculously survived a summer in the woods, conquering the heat, the threat of dehydration and starvation, the potentially hazardous terrain, flora and fauna, etc., the arrival of a Wisconsin winter would have presented him with 2 choices: return to society or die. With every day that passed, the odds of James still being alive grew slimmer. Investigators knew that. The pressure to find him was intense, and his persistent elusiveness was frustrating. To say that the situation was dire would be an understatement, which is why the FBI got involved. Their involvement began in August, about 2 months after James went missing. At that point, investigators knew there was a significant possibility that James was deceased. It was very possible that he might have died of accident or exposure in the woods, or that he might have taken his own life, or even that someone else may have taken his life.
Yeah, the main piece that still stands out that we haven't really discussed is the search for how to leave the state.
I'm glad you brought that up because James had looked at several different towns and locations, and investigators thought maybe he's planning to travel to them. Who knows? Maybe he was going to camp out and then hitchhike. Anything's really possible. So they checked into every single location that James had searched and looked into online, and they searched as thoroughly as they could, trying to find out if he could be there, and they had no luck.
Yeah, and I'm sure the FBI would have been a really good asset to have assist with that when you're talking about interstate travel.
Absolutely. It's one of the big things they do. Now, one thing the FBI did was they asked Bill to undergo a polygraph examination related to his son's disappearance. Bill agreed. Now, as we've often said on this show, polygraphs are pseudoscientific, so their results should be taken with a heap of salt. There's a reason why they're not considered admissible evidence in court. With that being said, Bill underwent the examination and passed. Throughout the investigation, he has cooperated with investigators, both local and federal, even as they explored the possibility that Bill himself could potentially have harmed his son.
When we first started talking about this case, I'd been holding back my suspicion of Bill. But when you showed me the still capture from the camera footage, that really did alleviate a lot of that, because that is not somebody that's being coerced into this by an abusive father figure.
No, we know that he left on his own that night.
I was also a little concerned when you originally said that there was that delay in him reporting it to the police, but James having his cell phone, again, that's easily explainable.
Yeah, nevertheless, the possibility of parental involvement is an uncomfortable matter that investigators virtually always have to explore in cases like these, because the fact is that, statistically speaking, most people who are killed by people they know, not strangers. Plus, it's not difficult to imagine a parent being upset if they found out that their child took off in the dead of night with their vehicle and their phone. Investigators probably wondered, what if James had come home that night, or Bill had somehow located him elsewhere and the confrontation had ended in violence? Now, like I said, it's the kind of thing investigators have to consider. They have to consider all possibilities. But no evidence ever arose to support such a theory. In fact, Detective Drew Bullen, who was one of the Sauk County detectives assigned to James' case, told WKOW News the following, quote, "We can't rule anything out below completely, but through our investigation, we feel pretty strongly that Bill is not and was not involved in James' disappearance," end quote.
And just to point on how important it is for investigators to go through this, it's incredibly poignant time for me personally, because you and I last night were just watching a documentary where investigators did not investigate into a father.
With tragic effect.
It turned out that for over 30 years, he was a serial killer and a serial offender.
Yes. Now, that was decades ago. Most investigators and police agencies have gotten better about that over time, and it's very fortunate.
Yes. Moments like that just highlight why that was so important. But he wasn't even prosecuted until around the time this case was going on. So it is a necessary discomfort, I will say.
Yes, and for anyone who's interested, that documentary was called Into the Fire, and it was excellent. This is not an ad. It just was really good. To add a little statistical context, for the record, children aged 13 or older are statistically far less likely to be killed by their parents than children under the age of 13. When it comes to the killings of children under age 13, the overwhelming majority, 4 out of 5, are committed by a parent. When it comes to children over age 13, though, only 1 in 5 killings is committed by a parent, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Which isn't to say that it doesn't happen, only that kids James' age are statistically far less likely to be killed by a parent than their younger counterparts.
That is a drastic change for that age group, though.
We know younger kids, their lives are controlled by their parents. They're pretty much always with caretakers, so when something happens to them, yes, it's usually a parent or caretaker. But older kids, once they reach their teens, they're more out in the world, they're interacting with others, peers, even strangers. So when they are killed, they are more often killed by somebody different, other than a parent.
Makes a lot of sense. That's when they're really starting to develop themselves as a person.
Right. Now, in any case, investigators don't believe that Bill was responsible for his son's disappearance. And for the record, they also spoke with his mom. She didn't seem to know anything about James' disappearance either. So what happened to James then? Why hasn't he been seen or heard from since June of 2023? There's definitely the possibility that he died somewhere in the woods, whether by accident or intentionally. And there's also another possibility, one that his dad clings to because it represents hope. Bill doesn't believe that James set out into the wilderness on his own that night. He believes that James was in contact with someone who convinced him to leave his home and to go somewhere with them. He believes that James met someone that night. Investigators considered this possibility too, especially when reviewing James' phone records. They looked for any sign that he'd been planning to meet or run away with someone, and according to Detective Bullen, they didn't find any such evidence. Detective Bullen told WKOW News, quote, "Nothing has pointed us in a direction that James was setting up a meeting or that he met with someone or that he had more of a grand plan than what we've come across this far," end quote. Since investigators had recovered the phone that James had taken, Bill's phone, they were able to conduct a thorough forensic investigation of the device. Here's the thing, though. That phone was not the only phone that James had had access to. There was another phone, one that disappeared along with him and still has not been found. According to Bill, James had another phone, one that was not connected to any phone plan. Because of that, James could use the phone and communicate via messaging apps, but only if he had Wi-Fi to connect to. And this is pretty common. There are a lot of kids whose parents may have given them a hand-me-down phone so that they can play games or use it to communicate at home using the household Wi-Fi.
It's very common in today's society.
Sure. Speaking of that, by the way, I think it could potentially explain why James also took his dad's phone. Maybe he took it so that he could set up a Wi-Fi hotspot for the other phone, the one that needed a Wi-Fi connection to be functional.
That is a really, really good point.
Yeah, and without that other phone in their possession, investigators have no real way of reviewing its contents. It's theoretically possible that James could have been using that phone to discreetly communicate with someone, potentially via any number of popular encrypted messaging apps, which you only need an internet connection to use.
Absolutely.
Bill worries that his son might have been manipulated and exploited in some way, or perhaps even trafficked. And it's not an unreasonable concern. There are definitely cases of teens getting lured into trafficking schemes via online messaging conversations. Such cases are something I've been exposed to in the course of my work, so I get why a parent would worry about this. The existence of predators who target victims this way is undeniable. And on that note, when you hear the word trafficking, you probably think of young women being sexually exploited. And while there are, unfortunately, many cases like that, there are other kinds of trafficking as well, like labor trafficking, where victims are manipulated or forced into performing work, often manual labor under poor or even hazardous conditions. And yes, when it comes to sex trafficking, a small number of victims are male. However, no evidence has arisen to suggest that this is what happened to James. Still, the thought haunts James' dad, who believes that his son is still alive somewhere. Bill feels that this may explain why canines were unable to detect James' scent at the makeshift campsite near the side of the highway. He told a reporter for The Independent that he didn't think James spent much time at the site and said, quote, "I think he left with somebody. I think he sat there and waited for a horn to honk and came out and got in the car with somebody," end quote.
I mean, it is possible that both campsites were staged.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also possible that, somebody did meet with him and told him to dispose of the phone when they got there, or threw the phone out because they had seen him with it. And that's why it was on the other side of the road.
What if he got into a vehicle with somebody, they turned around, went down the other side of the highway, and threw the phone out the window? I mean, there are so many possibilities. This really is a very perplexing case. On that note, I suppose it's also possible, Scott, that someone other than James may have taken his belongings out into the woods and abandoned them at those makeshift campsites. Probably not very likely, but possible as far as we know anyway.
It would be an extreme measure for an organized trafficker to go to cover it up that thoroughly.
Yes, it would be.
But it does, in my opinion, raise the concern of a potential serial predator.
Sure, keep in mind that when it comes to individuals who might be trying to groom children online, it's not necessarily a trafficker. It could just be an independent pervert, So Bill remains hopeful that he'll see James again and told WKOW News that he prays every day for James to be sitting on the couch in their living room when he gets home from work. So far, that hasn't happened. Like many desperate parents in similar situations, Bill has tried everything he can think of, including consulting psychics. One told him that James had gotten into a vehicle with someone else and had gone west. And Bill wasn't the only one desperate enough to contact a psychic either. According to reporting by John Giddings, detectives assigned to this case have also spoken with numerous individuals identifying as mediums and alleging that they could provide information. Many of those individuals indicated that James had indeed traveled west, perhaps to Colorado or Montana. And sure, those tips were vague and, of course, impossible to verify, but Sauk County investigators reached out to authorities in those states anyway and asked them to be on the lookout for James. Because when you're trying to find a missing child, just about anything seems worth a shot.
Absolutely.
What's it going to hurt? Bill has also entertained the idea that his son might have remained in the area in Wisconsin, mostly because after James went missing, he hung a lot of flyers repeatedly in the area around Devil's Lake State Park, only for them to immediately be torn down each time. And who does that? So he's wondered whether James might have been the one to tear down the flyers, not wanting to be found. At the time of this recording, though, it's been nearly 2 years since James' disappearance. 2 cold Wisconsin winters have come and gone, and the idea of him remaining in the area unseen and undetected for so long seems very unlikely. Despite the efforts of the Sauk County Sheriff's Office and other agencies, including the FBI, James remains missing. Detective Boulin told WKOW News, quote, "We've done everything that we can possibly think of in an attempt to locate James. We've literally exhausted everything that our agency can think of. So we're relying on the public information coming to us to push us in a new direction," end quote. If you have any information on the disappearance or whereabouts of James Yoblonski, please call the Sauk County Sheriff's Office at 608-355-4495. Or, if you wish to remain anonymous, the Sauk County Crime Stoppers at 888-847-7285. At the time of this recording, James' family is offering a $10,000 reward for information leading to resolution. If you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved disappearance of Luke Pyongdae. Luke and James' cases are not related, but they both involve the unsolved disappearances of boys who left their family homes in the night and haven't been seen or heard from since. We aired our episode on Luke's disappearance in August of 2024. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like James to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from our every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive was written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.